Dr. Campbell, I'm so pleased to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us at the Whole Health Macrobiotic Forum. So we really appreciate you. And for all of our listeners, we ask that you hold your questions because there's a lot of information to cover. So thank you for coming, and go ahead.
Okay, I am bringing up my slides now. I don't know why they're not coming up.
No, that's fine. We see them.
Well,
Oh, no, we don't. No, sorry, we don't.
for some reason, the wrong ones came up. Just a second. Okay, here we go. Okay, thank you. Again, I really appreciate your invitation and for make this presentation to your group. This is the first of two that I'll be speaking about. And so I've been in this business for a long time, more than 6 decades, actually, professionally. And I've focused my work down on 2 ideas as far as food consumption is concerned. And in the first lecture, I'm going to talk about one of the ideas, and the second one is the second idea. In this first lecture, I want to talk about protein, with a focus on protein, particularly of a certain kind. I'm going to start out with what I consider now to be the simplest of recommendations as far as diet is concerned, the kind of recommendations we can all remember, I think, if you will, without getting caught up in the details. Namely, I say consume plants, vegetables, fruits, grains, whole grains, the kind of thing. The second thing is consume them in the whole food form. And we can chop them up, we can cook them, we can do this and that. But the point is that we consume the food so that the body has an opportunity to look at all the nutrients in the food, sort of simultaneously to deal with it the way it wants to. Now, when I say consume plants, I'm talking about obviously not consuming animal food for its so-called high quality protein. And that's one of the focus that I'm going to be, one of the foci, I guess you could say, that I'm going to work on here. We also should acknowledge too, this fact that as we consume more animal food, plant food comes down, because I'm talking about a zero-sum game as far as food consumption is concerned. We tend to consume enough food to get enough calories, more or less. And so when we consume more animal food, plant food goes down, and plant food plays a role in this, a major role. So when we see correlations of, let's say, disease outcome with animal foods, we should recognize this is representing also the contribution of the loss of plant food to that effect. Now, on the question concerning protein, I want to bring you back a few years to 1839, when protein was discovered by a Dutch chemist at the time. And this was the first nutrient that was discovered, so to speak, at least looking back, was the first nutrient that was discovered. It was a chemical in meat that was required for dogs to survive. And he was using dogs for experimentation. And he learned that, or got the impression that the dogs, if they didn't have meat, they couldn't survive. So he was set about trying to isolate a chemical out of the food and found this chemical in there, had to give it a name, gave it a name after the Greek word proteos, which means of prime importance. So I like to say that the history of protein consumption started out with the baptism of this word, meaning of prime importance, protein from the proteos. So why? Why did that happen? The subject of my presentation, if you will. Because move some things out of the way. Okay. Sorry about that. I got things here in my way here. Just a second. All kinds of. Can we cut off? Never mind. That's okay. Never mind. Okay. So historically, I'm going to suggest that there's no nutrient that has influenced dietary choice, broadly speaking. For the more influenced dietary choice than animal-based protein. I'm going to say it's not specifically only because of the effect of the protein itself on health consequences. It's the combination, as I say, the loss of plant food consumption. I consider protein, essentially animal protein, that is, to be a driver nutrient. It's an indicator. It's a grand indicator of the kind of diet that we should supposedly be consuming. Now, after it was discovered by Mulder in 1839, his younger colleague, took it up, and he referred to it as the stuff of life itself. It's quite a baptism, quite frankly. He was in turn, just a fun league, he was in turn the founder of organic chemistry, looking back, as well as the founder of the idea of using fertilization to promote to plant growth. He was also credited, unfortunately, with the emphasis given that we had used today to scientific materialism. And scientific materialism is when we try to take nutrition apart into, sort of talk about all of the individual parts, such as nutrients, and so forth. And we tend to think of disease as one disease at a time. And so we work on the idea that we can somehow figure this whole thing out through materialistic sort of analysis. Now, I got involved in this some years ago, and I need to mention this because it bears on what I'm going to say, which tends to be quite controversial to some folks. I got involved in this early on when I was at Cornell University, started in 1956, eventually doing a master's and a doctorate there. This was the subject of my doctoral thesis, a little bit technically expressed here, but it was addressed to the idea that we should consume more animal-based protein. In those days, we tend to think protein is protein is protein, not necessarily dividing it into animal plant sources. But my doctoral dissertation really was on the idea of promoting the consumption of more of that great animal protein. Then I took an academic position not too long thereafter, where I was responsible for helping to develop a model for feeding malnourished children. And those of us in nutrition thought that at the time that the key thing about malnourished children was to make sure they got enough protein. And so that's what I was about. But I happen to have seen some evidence, and I should say very weak evidence to some extent, that children consuming the most protein, they were coming from the few families consuming, like we do in the West, but the children consuming the most protein seemed to have a risk of getting liver cancer. Then there was this study that came up in India at that time, adding to the concern. Namely, this was a study of the effect of protein on the development of liver cancer in rats, in this particular case. And so the idea of these researchers was that if they gave them more protein, after starting the cancer with the chemical, if they gave more protein, the higher protein consumption would actually attenuate the carcinogenic effect. In other words, reduce the cancer. And what they can see, as you can see here, animals given 20% of total energy as protein, compared to animals given 5%, 20%, 5%. Instead of the 20% animals protecting against the cancer, the other ones got the cancer. It was really stark. I mean, it was really, it was exactly the opposite what I had been led to believe, both coming from a farm, I should say, and milking cows and on into my graduate work, that it was a wake-up call, not to believe, I guess you could say. So it suggested a broader concept that increasing protein consumption might increase cancer. And incidentally, the protein they were using in this particular case was the protein of cow's milk. So I came back home in my laboratory at Virginia Tech at the time and organized a study with some students and others to study this question. Is it really true that protein causes cancer? This was crazy. So I'm going to just show you here one of about 100 slides I could select from, but just one to make a point that I found really stark. Namely, this is a representation of what happens to cancer growth during this first 12 weeks after starting the cancer with a gene mutation. This is where the chemical carcinogen is used to start the cancer. So we started here. And these two, and we fed them either these laboratory rats, either 20% protein, and you can see the cancer is growing there, presumably quite well during this first 12 weeks. The animals fed 5%.
Dr. Campbell, we're still seeing your first introductory slide, human health with all the fruit on it, environmental health and food choice.
I don't know what's happening. I'm looking at my own here. Darn it. What should I do?
Maybe go back on your.
I got to stop sharing. Go back.
Yeah.
Now we'll go back again. Sorry about that. This is terrible. Never had that problem before. Okay, can you see it now?
There we go. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, well, that's a little bit different. Okay, okay, so there we go. Thank you. So this is, as I say, the first 12 weeks of growth to develop the cancer. And animals fed 20% protein, the cancers are growing quite well. Animals fed 5% are not, okay? Then I tried something else here that really caught my attention. Namely, if we started them off for the first 3 weeks on 20% protein, the cancers are growing. We switched it to 5, turned it off. Turn it on, turn it off. I mean, the idea that we could turn cancer on and off by simply adjusting the protein intake was really, that was eye-opening. It really was at the same time, basically extraordinary confirmation of what the Indian workers had actually learned about in the beginning. Incidentally, the Indian researchers themselves did not believe what they did. I went to India 25 years later to remind them of that fact. But in reality, this is what I saw. So this suggested a lot of big stuff, namely nutrition rather than genes could control cancer development. And that story I could elaborate over a few hours and with lots of evidence, but basically that is really what cancer is about. It's about the nutrition effect, on the genes that are mutated by a chemical. It's a nutritional effect that actually controls cancer development. So now, having reached that particular point then, at that time, I was interested in finding the mechanism, the biochemical mechanism to explain this effect. That's what we do in research. We, especially on a provocative idea like this, is if this is real, let's figure out what the mechanism is. Because if we can understand the biochemical mechanism, if you will, we might have an opportunity to, let's say, administer a drug and block this nasty effect. And so we studied in those days, and still do to these days, we studied cancer in 2 different ways. We studied it basically to determine what the mechanism was, but we looked at cancer as a representation shown here as 3 stages. Cancer starts out with an initiation stage, a promotion stage when the cancer's cells are dividing to grow into a tumor. And then finally they get diagnosed and they progress, maybe go into other tissues. But in any case, I looked for a mechanism here in the first stage. And in the initial thing, we learned that the high protein diet increased the rate of entry of the carcinogen into the cell. I could have stopped there and said, now we know what it is. We could develop a drug and block that entry, if you will. But we went on to look for some more. It also increased the enzyme called mixed function oxidase that activates the carcinogen. It increased the amount that was being synthesized. It also changed its structure, but all of which sort of result in the same thing. The higher protein diet increased the enzyme activity that subsequently led to the production of a product that then bound itself chemically to DNA, which is the stuff of genes. That was the beginning mutation. Then we have in our body's ability to repair that on a routine basis. The high protein diet actually repressed that. The one good thing we had going for us, the animal protein repressed it. So here we had a situation that every time I looked for a mechanism, we found one. Then we went to the second stage. The second stage, I saw much the same thing. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into details here, but we saw the same thing. We found a number of mechanisms, each of which have their own identity, their own purpose, their own location in cells. And it turned out the high protein diet changed every single one in sync, as if it were a symphony, all working together. I mean, that idea just I found astounding. But they basically established, for one, that the high protein diet is real. It really does increase cancer, and it doesn't, we have to rely on the idea that we found one mechanism. I got up to finding 10. 8 of them increased in activity, 2 of them decreased, but they all led to the same result. They worked in unison to increase cancer. So now the question arises, the first question I had to address, which mechanism counts? Can we actually maybe develop a drug, block the whole process? I don't think so. I don't think so. So at this point, I want to turn your now attention to some human studies that have been subsequently conducted by other researchers over those last 50, 60, 70 years. And here again, I want to show you something that most researchers don't consider this way, but I really find it quite astounding, and it does support the idea that I've just told you. Namely, if in this particular case, this is a research group back in the 1960s, who were comparing dietary practices, let's say, with the occurrence of kidney cancer or the incidence of renal cancer. And for these different countries, as shown here in this chart, you can see that as animal protein consumption is increased, you see there, kidney cancer is increased. They didn't draw that line on there. I drew that regression line myself, using a metric that we could use at the time. But what you can see here is almost a straight line relationship between consuming little animal protein and the occurrence of cancer. This is kidney cancer. Amazing. Amazing. Then there was a second study. In this case, it was animal protein and heart disease. It was published in 1959. More animal protein consumption and more heart disease. Here's one much later years on non-fat milk and prostate cancer. These are all separate studies. I'm sorry, I'm going to take a second here to eliminate some interference I have with my. Okay, there we go. So there's a relationship between non-fat milk consumption and prostate cancer. Again, the same line. Here's one for saturated fat and breast cancer. Again, we're seeing the same line. I'm going back and drawing these lines myself and these data that I collected from the literature. I knew some of these folks myself. There's one for, let's say, we reverse the axes. There's one for cholesterol intake and heart disease. That's something that we sort of known for a long time. The higher the cholesterol intake, the higher the rate of heart disease. Every one of these, we're seeing these very impressive data. Separate studies, separate research groups. Here's one for meat consumption, colon cancer. Here's one for total fat consumption and uterine cancer. We're always seeing the same thing. These lines, these regression lines, are all sort of linear in nature, and they go down and they, so to speak, intercept the axis, the XY axis near zero, which means as soon as you start, in theory, putting in a little animal protein, you can expect to see some theoretical increase in that particular outcome. Now, here's the thing I want to bring to your attention. All those different things like meat consumption, like cholesterol intake or meat or total fat, low fat milk, actually, they are all, we should not be considered them. Unfortunately, they've been considered as independent causes of cancer. I don't like to think of them that way. They all turn out to be surrogates or indicators of animal protein itself. The mere idea of consuming more animal protein to get that good protein, if you will, triggers the consumption of these kinds of foods that contain these kinds of things. So these indicators, these factors, risk factors, if you will, are nothing more than surrogates or representatives of animal protein intake. And this is one more point I'd like to make here, that these correlations are observed only for animal protein, not for plant protein. There was a real study here done at the time, looking at unsaturated fat. It was my friend Ken Carroll that did this, and there was no relationship for plant protein. So these interesting regression lines, very impressive as they are, all representing the consumption of animal protein-based foods. So there, I want to raise this question now. Where did this desire for more protein arise? Especially the idea that the protein of animal food is high quality. especially the kind of protein that's consumed among economically affluent countries. That's what we've done historically. When we have the money, we want to consume protein, and we tend to assume, at least either subconsciously or consciously, we tend to assume that protein is present in meat or in animal products. We kind of forgot about the idea of proteins in plants too, but we consume the animal products in order to get that protein, that high quality protein. So I've been troubled by this idea for my entire career since I did my doctoral dissertation. Why do we call protein high quality? Some kind of protein high quality, others not. Let's look at this question a little bit. What is protein quality? Well, the concept of protein quality is referred to as the representation. It's a representation of the amount of protein that's being retained in the body. So with X amount of protein being consumed, if a higher proportion is retained in the body for its good uses, if you will, we call it biological value or quality. Biological value, quality, same thing. So in other words, the proteins that when we consume them, if more of it's retained in the body at that test during that test period, if more is retained in the body, we consider it to have higher biological value or high quality. And it turns out animal proteins as a group, they are retained at a higher rate and therefore have higher quality. Plant proteins are retained somewhat less so and are said to have lower quality. So it was that concept that animal proteins or animal foods actually contain the protein that's better retained. It's better retained. And who doesn't want quality? I mean, that's really what led to this almost subconscious belief over time that we had, first off, we needed protein. It was of prime importance. Secondly, we need to get it from animals, basically, which is really not true, just because it was said to be higher quality. Everybody wants quality, and that's understood. So the man who actually invented this idea from a scientific point of view was H.H. Mitchell, University of Illinois professor at the time, published it in 1924. He said a method for determining biological value of protein. And as I say here again, it represents the more protein being retained for basically, he was observed and others observed that the more protein is retained per unit protein consumed, the greater the body weight gain. That was considered, that's a pretty good deal, especially for raising livestock like pigs and chickens and so forth. In other words, and rats in the laboratory, they were learning that if they fed a protein of an animal source that had, it actually stimulated growth rate a little more. That was impressive, I guess. And who doesn't want more body weight gain, so to speak? So that goes, but that's not really the greatest idea in the world for humans, but nonetheless, this is what it was. Greater body weight gain, more profit for livestock-based agriculture, basically. So the idea survived. I might point out at this juncture that H.H. Mitchell, some 11 years before, was joined in a conversation with some other researchers at the time that those societies in the world that consume low protein or less protein, or they don't consume animal food, they were basically racially inferior. Quite a statement, especially in the context of the conversation that we're having these days. It was suggested that those societies that didn't get enough animal protein were racially inferior. Quite a stark, dramatic statement, I might add, obviously. So now I want to bring to your attention something new that no one else talks about. It's time that we start talking about this. Unfortunately, my colleagues in science are not talking about this because they tend to work on one idea at a time. So they're missing it. Namely, when a high quality animal-based protein is consumed or being retained, here's something else it does. And this is all based on peer-reviewed, very thorough research has been conducted and published, okay? When more of the protein is retained, supposedly to increase growth rate, it also increases growth hormone. It increases production of growth hormone. That in turn is associated with higher risk of a number of different cancers. It also increases blood estrogen. That's the female hormone, the steroid, if you will, as you know. The higher the circulating levels of estrogen in the blood of a female, of a woman, the higher is her risk of getting breast cancer. The earlier is the age of menarche, and the later is the stage of the menstruation. I mean, later the age of
Menopause.
menopause. Yes, I couldn't think of the word. So anyhow, higher protein creates growth hormones and increases circulating levels of estrogen. It also increases, this is research we did ourselves, increases the production of free radicals. Free radicals are little beasties that actually stimulate aging of cells and stimulates cancer development. But also higher protein increases cancer mutations, but it decreases natural killer cells. That was the second part of that slide I showed before. In other words, these are all observations that have been done independently, showing that consuming more animal protein causes these things in addition to increasing growth rate. All of them increase cancer. So in other words, high quality protein not only increases growth rate, if you will, in theory, it increases cancer by a number of different mechanisms. I'm sure there's a lot more if we were to take the time to have a look. It also does something else. A higher protein, higher animal protein, that is, increases the production of cholesterol in the body, the serum cholesterol, increase the total amount of cholesterol as well as the LDL cholesterol, which in turn relates to heart disease. Incidentally, this was discovered in 1906 first, and then it was researched for about 15 years by a number of different research groups. Finally, in 1926, a research group from University of Michigan published a summary of that research and said, look, it's not about the cholesterol we consume that causes heart disease. It's not about the fat we consume. It's about the animal protein. So that was, as I say, that it goes way back. Everybody just kind of forgot about it at the time. But basically, a higher animal protein diet increases this here, increases the risk of heart disease. A diet that has more animal protein in it as well, partly because of the decrease in plant foods, but increase in blood sugar and A1C, which is associated with the diabetes. So here, high quality protein, we make a decision. We want to get protein. We assume it only comes from animals, and what we get for it in return. These are the things we get. Increased diabetes, increased heart disease, increased cancer. And that's not exactly what I would call high quality food consumption. Now, this argument about emphasizing, or this push to emphasize the consumption of protein, animal protein in particular, goes on until the present day. Throughout the literature, certainly during my lifetime, the last 60, 70 years or so, throughout this time, every time that somebody would come along and maybe question the consumption of animal protein for whatever reason, they ran into problems, serious problems. So there's always been this contention in the community, all one-sided. Everybody assumes we need protein, it needs to be animal-based because it's high quality. It continues until the present day. And what I'm going to show you here is a representation of the amount of protein that we actually need as a percent of total calories, okay? And what I'm showing in this bar are some numbers that represent different categories of protein consumption. That represent the 5 to 6% protein is the minimum amount needed for just retaining. We need protein. Protein is essential, but we only need about 5 to 6% to compensate for the protein that's being lost. That was done in an experiment in 1943, the first time, repeated many times since. But that in turn, that's a little bit too low to recommend to the public. So they got around to making a recommendation, a daily allowance, they said, RDA. So the RDA is around 9-10% or so of protein. And this is the number that we tend to live with. We oftentimes will call it the minimum protein intake. It's not really quite the minimum, but it's adequate. It's more than adequate. We get all the protein we need if we're consuming around 9 to 10% protein. But in reality, this is the level we've become accustomed to in Western countries, at least. This is the level of protein we all tend to consume. This is the 95% bar. That is to say, from the lowest of 5% to the highest 5%, or the lowest 2.5% to the highest 2.5%. This is the range of protein intake that in the United States, at least, we've become accustomed to. Somewhere between about 11 or so percent up to some little more than 22% protein. So we're living way up here, almost all of us, in excess of the amount of protein we need. And to get to the point, 75 to 80% of this total protein we consume, at least I'm using US figures in this case, 75 to 80% of the total protein being consumed is animal-based. So this brings me back to the information I just shared with you earlier. Animal protein is a problem. So we're really consuming not only a lot more protein than we need, we're getting most of it from animal sources, which then in turn can translate into increased cancer rates, increased diabetes, cancer, and so forth. And that's exactly what we see. So those slides I showed you before, up here in the corner of the slide, you can see here, just a quick reminder. We saw those lines, you notice here, starts up from zero animal protein intake, if you will. We see those regression lines. I'm superimposing that line more or less here because it turns out that plant foods, whatever kind of plant foods you choose to eat, vegetable foods, grains, and so forth, it will supply the 9 or 10% we need. We do not need to consume animal foods in order to get that good protein. It's simply not necessary. Plants can be consumed. When they're consumed, they can actually get higher protein levels, all the way up to 15, 16, maybe even 20%, if you consume a lot of legumes and things like that. Not a problem, because plant protein is not the problem. Besides, plant has a lot of other things that are protective mechanisms against any theoretical protein intakes, protein effects that might occur. So I'm just superimpose that line there over the range of protein we consume. We can assume that within this range here, we can see increases in disease risk. Increase in disease risk, as I was showing up here in the lower left-hand corner. Okay, so yes, so whole plant food diets provided enough protein, around 9-10%. We don't need animal foods to get the protein. Now, just not so long ago, 2002 to be exact, and I know the details of this quite well because I know these individuals personally, some of them at least, and some of the key people. I've been on some of these kind of committees myself, so I know the workings of how this works. The Institute of Medicine, the National Academy of Science, determined in their infinite wisdom that we should have, for all the nutrition, we should have a so-called upper safe level of consumption. Not a bad idea, I guess, to come up with this metric. This was done in 2002. They set the upper safe level for protein at 35%. In other words, nothing untoward, nothing problematic should occur. We can consume up to that level. We can't even get up to that level if we consumed 100% animal food diet hardly. It just doesn't quite get there. So this was a very nefarious kind of recommendation, I might suggest, to suggest that we can consume protein up to that level. Wow. And that what that does, that in turn, that number then translates into a lot of government regulations. It's a level that is used, for example, to establish our thinking around school lunch programs or around other kinds of programs, any kind of government regulated programs. Consume all the protein we can get, and we can go up that level, no worries. They don't want to refer to this right here. So what in the world was that all about? I call it mob power. I really get quite angry about this because I know the details of it. It turns out the committee working for some 5 years on this question of what was the upper safe level for nutrient intake, came up with that number. It turns out the committee itself produced a report over 1,000 pages long, did not endorse this 35%. That 35% came from a news release that followed the finish of the committee's work. I called a couple of members of the committee when I saw it first and asked them, what in the world are you doing? They didn't even know about it. That 35% figure came out of a news release that was right in the lead statement of the news release that went every place from New York Times to whatever. Now we can consume protein levels, not that people pay much attention to those numbers, but in any case, it led to this idea that protein is so important. We can go up there, no worries. And it was, in a sense, it was a deflection away from this kind of information here, suggesting that as we consume more protein, we can experience more of these kind of diseases. It was really a really ridiculous kind of recommendation. The individual who was in control of that particular recommendation, determining that 35%, then at the same time was the chairman of the Dietary Guidelines Committee that uses this information to come up with some recommendations, for what the public should hear. So I ask the question, why is 35% when 10% is enough? And when in fact, that 10% can be provided by any kind of whole food plant-based diet. In theory, could you eat potatoes all day long? Not that we would do that, but they even have enough protein. So the whole protein argument over the years, all the way from its inception, its baptism, through its being touted as the thing to sort of form our diets around, that whole idea is what I'm suggesting is simply wrong. And so you have to look at the funding support that produced that particular report. The Dannon Institute, this is the premier dairy institute group in the world. International Life Sciences Institute, also very much into the Western kind of diet. Corporate Donors Fund, that was a fund there that a lot of corporations can contribute to kind of hide their names. Roche Vitamins, Mead Johnson, M&M Mars, of all people. And all of these people here were supporting that. And I say, being a little bit sarcastic to say the least, the academic charlatans, buffoons who sort of participate in this idea of representing the interests of the corporate world against public health. So now let me sort of try to summarize those few remarks into what I consider to be nutrition. I really think of nutrition is in desperate need of a new definition. It's not about sort of summing up the effects of a lot of individual nutrients and what they can do and how much we consume. It's not about that, and I'll talk about that in the next lecture. The nutrition that really works for our benefit, I call it holistic nutrition. And I'd like to put the W in front of it to emphasize the idea that I'm talking about a scientific concept. It's the whole, it's really the whole of everything. It's multiple nutrients. Each nutrient having multiple mechanisms, and the collection of nutrients, in a sense, affecting multiple disease outcomes. I'll mention that in the next lecture too, and in turn leading to multiple health improvements. So holistic nutrition is really an amazing concept in my view. It's all we need to do is to consume the kind of food that provides that kind of nutrition. And I say that's the whole food plant-based diet. Plant-based is a reference, of course, to the fact that we should consume plants and not animals to get our protein intake. Whole food is the subject of the next lecture. So I think that our recommendations as far as nutrition is concerned and diet really reduce their simplest possible levels without getting entangled in all the details of this sort of thing. It's just very simple. Consume plants and try as much as possible to keep in a whole food form. As I say, we can cook them, we can dice them, cut them up and all that kind of stuff, but not take them apart and sort of take out things like oil or sugar or something like that. I'm talking about whole food, okay? Whole plant-based. So I'm going to finish off then really quickly here with another sort of add-on. My ideas in this field actually gradually work from that point of view of having a new understanding of protein, particularly, to the idea of using whole food, involving all the nutrients working together. And so when I published with my son, who's now a physician at a medical school, when I published with my son, the China study, at that time, I had an opportunity to go back into the literature to see if, in fact, there was any previous literature by other researchers that was suggestive, let's say, of the same sort of conclusion that we were drawing for the purpose of writing the book, The China Study. And here I'm just summarizing that whole food plant-based diet prevents, suspends, or actually reverses, in many cases, reverses or cures these diseases. There's evidence in the literature. Meager, in each case, meager at the time when it was produced, but actually going back and having a look to see whether it could fit into this equation of a whole food plant-based diet. All of these diseases here appear to be, in one way or another, affected by a whole food plant-based diet. In other words, this diet is broad, rapid, and it can reverse, that is, treat illness once it's present. Diabetes, heart disease come to mind in particular. My colleagues working in that area have shown that. Esselstyn, Ornish, Dr. McDougall, so forth. But saying on the one hand, now with the current interest on viral diseases, I have a question. Does this apply to viral diseases? You won't see a viral disease here in this case, for example. I want to show you some data that we got in a study that we did in China, a huge study at the time, and I'll make a reference to that going to the next slide, I think. But in any case, I'm raising a question of whether or not viral diseases might be considered. Viral diseases, here's some here. HIV, AIDS, measles, these are all viral diseases. Hepatitis B causing liver cancer, I'll mention that in a moment. Ebola, common cold, flu. I mean, we've been living with viral diseases forever. Viruses have been on the earth before we humans were here. And so they come and they go. Some of them are nasty. Some of them can cause problems, obviously. We got to be concerned about it. But they've come and gone, and they basically, our bodies deal with these viruses basically through the immune system and other mechanisms too, but the immune system is important. So I'm raising this question in reference to COVID-19. Let me show you something here that I found pretty astounding. When the story broke about the coronavirus in the early last year of 2020, I recall some data we had gotten in our study in China, a huge study, where we collect a lot of nutritional information, a lot of disease information and so forth in the early 1980s. And we also did that study a second time in 1989. It was even bigger, that included Taiwan as well as mainland China. But we had a huge body of data. So went back into the data to see if I could recall some information on the liver cancer virus disease, if you will. And I'm going to summarize really quickly what we found. Basically, schematically, if you will, using hepatitis B virus as the model in this case for the virus. First off, there's the so-called virus out there in the community in one form or another, water, air, or whatever. It's out there in the community. It's called an antigen. In this case, I'm calling it hepatitis B surface antigen. It's a particular antigen, the virus for the liver cancer. It comes and invades our human body. Okay, now it's there. We test for it. We're positive. Don't see the symptoms yet. It's asymptomatic. So we test positive here for this particular virus, if you will. At that point in time, in theory, that virus can go on. If it hangs around, it can cause problems. Like in the case of liver cancer, it causes liver cancer. That's the symptoms. If it hangs around, though, if it's there and something comes up and sort of inactivates it, immunizes us against it, now we form antibodies. So a virus lands, all viruses do this, and other nasty pathogens, if you will. They come into our body, they can either begin to cause their symptoms eventually, or we can form antibodies against them. This is the purview of the immune system acting here. Let's see what we found. We had in that China study, we looked at a bunch of nutritional factors affecting the amount of liver cancer that occurred in different parts of the country. Whether all of these things here you can see. And liver cancer is a serious viral disease. It kills right 800,000 deaths per year. It's been doing that for decades, or upwards of that. It's actually increasing, actually. And so I want to show you what we've learned about this here. This is from the second time we did that study in China, the prevalence of hepatitis B virus in 1989. Okay, the infection comes in as active virus. Okay, there's the antigen, liver cancer. Here's the inactive, what I just showed you. This is the innate immunity, I'm going to call it. It turns out the animal food in China, people consuming animal food, it was only a very small amount. On average, it was only like 10% of the amount we do in the West. People who consume animal food, they're the ones that kept the virus around and got liver cancer. In other words, a higher level of antigen in people consuming some animal food, and they're the ones that got the liver cancer. People consuming plant food, they formed antibodies and did not get the liver cancer. The same model that applies to heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and so forth. So I'm being very brief here. I can show you a lot more details, but in any case, what we're seeing here is a representation for this virus, a nutritional effect on this virus that's very similar to what we have been seeing for the other diseases as well. And by the way, we had access to 11 risk factors considering this particular case, and I only used the ones that were highly significant, probability level of 0.001, all converging to the same outcome. So the fact that, I mean, correlations, just correlations alone don't infer causation, of course, if we're thinking about one thing at a time. In this case, we got a bunch of correlations, all converging to the same endpoint, focusing on food, not one thing, causing liver cancer. The same model I just showed you previously. One more story about as to whether or not I'm suggesting, is it possible that this may apply to the COVID-19? Here are some data for people 60 years of age who are, if they're getting most of the coronavirus problems, not all, but a big percentage of them. These people, the ones who actually get the disease and suffer the consequences, 95% or so have no comorbidity. They're more vulnerable to the consequences of the virus. So they've been suffering poor nutrition, if you will, up and they have their diseases. Then in turn, that is a risk factor that sort of lays the ground for more severe COVID disease if the virus should infect. It turns out the whole food plant-based diet, we know this, the whole food plant-based diet prevents diabetes, heart disease, and all these kind of things that gives the fertile grounds for formation of these serious diseases like coronavirus. But also in our case, the whole food plant-based diet enters in another place too. It actually intercepts the effect of the virus on disease severity. It is forming antibodies, and one more thing it does, it tends to repress the production of the natural killer cells, which are the early sort of actors in the immune response to coronaviruses. So the whole food plant-based diet, actually, I'm just raising a question, might have an effect. I published this information with some difficulty back in February at the Nutrition Journal, the European Journal of Nutrition, or the EC Journal of Nutrition. In any case, that was just a suggestion made in February. In June, there was another paper came out on a poll showing that the polls are a little bit weak in terms of detecting effects, but in this case, these authors found that people consuming, broadly speaking, plant-based or pescatarian diets saw a 73% decrease in the severity of the COVID infection. That was a publication here. And then there have been a subsequent publication showing the same thing. So I want to be careful about this, because I'm not saying that consuming a whole food plant-based diet is going to prevent the problems, occurring from, let's say, a virus that we now have. It's a nasty virus that we're suffering at the present time. What I am suggesting, though, however, is the fact that good nutrition can intercept that possibility early on and keep our immune system active and prevent the problems from occurring in the first place. And in fact, because of the rapidity with which it works, it can act at a second level too. So in any case, this going too fast to this whole presentation, but if we go back, I published with, I say, my son, Tom Campbell, who has a physician degree now. We published the China study in 2005, been republished in 2016. It's been, I was surprised that when I published this information at that time, I did not know it was going to have the impact it has. It's since been, there's now close to 4 million copies of it sold. It's been translated into 50 foreign languages. So it's really kind of surprised me. I did this after I retired in the early 2000s. And then with another book that I'll mention in the next lecture, this is the most recent one, published with in this case, with my grandson, sort of making the argument that the future of nutrition, if we're going to think about using nutrition, which has not been considered very seriously, if we're going to think about that, we've got to think about how do we institutionalize it in a sense in the activities that we do at the governmental level. Sorry, I rushed through this thing much too fast, but I'm going to stop here for a moment, and we can take maybe a couple of questions or so. I'll take a break and we'll restart at the top of the hour for the second lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If you want to stop your slideshow and
Yes,
see if there are any
sorry.
questions. That was amazing.
I'm sorry, I stumbled through that, tried to do better, but I was going wrong and trying to keep within the time, but anyhow.
It's incredible information. Who has questions? Because if not, I've got plenty.
Yes,
I do. Am I the first?
yes,
Yes.
okay.
Hi,
Ellen?
Dr. Campbell. Yeah, thank you. I've admired your work for decades. Thank you. And I have a quick question. I'm a dietitian and I work with people. Sometimes I hear like an endocrinologist told one of my patients who has osteoporosis, lots of dairy. I've heard other people say this, lots of dairy and lots of protein. She's 100 pounds, 100 grams of protein to 120 grams of protein, which can only be achieved really through animal food. And I don't want to be critical of that, doctor, but I know that's old thinking. So I was just wondering what you have to say about that.
It's totally wrong. There's two things, and I'll speak for the U.S. case in this case. The institution that actually oversees the training of dietitians actually is heavily funded by the dairy industry and other animal industries. In reality, we've known this since the 1980s. The higher the consumption of calcium, if you compare different countries, the higher the risk for osteoporosis. We did a very similar study in China ourselves. The higher the consumption of dairy or the higher consumption of animal protein, the higher is the risk for osteoporosis, period. So there's no dispute about that. And so for people who would say otherwise, I'm sorry, they're not keeping up with the literature.
It's amazing. Thank you.
I have a question also.
Hi.
Selma, my name is Selma. I have read this book about the 4 types of blood and how people should eat according to those blood types. And they recommend people with O type blood to eat not a lot, but to base their food more towards animal protein.
Yeah,
And
I
to
remember.
keep away from the legumes.
I should answer that question in 2 ways. I saw the book when it came out. I was interested because what the heck, blood type does have some. It's an indication of certain risk for certain diseases, if you will. And I thought there might be something there. I got to about page 35. I had to quit because the material that was being discussed was just totally ridiculous. I gave it to a couple of postdocs of mine who read it too, also had the same reaction. That is wrong. The blood type diet was an interesting idea at the time. Fortunately, it hasn't survived very long. I'm surprised you're still reading it this many years later. But that story was put to bed a long time ago.
Mm-hmm. And what about if I am a type O?
I'm type O. I'm type O myself.
And I have difficulty. I have stomach problems when I eat legumes. Although I am a vegan, but mostly, but I have difficulty with them.
Well, then sometimes we do have an issue concerning allergies that form to certain kinds of grains and legumes, perhaps. It may be working a little bit on maybe have an allergy, a slight allergy, if you will, to one or more of the legumes. And it's a good time to just do a little test, eliminate one at a time and see how it works, and just come to some ideas of your own. Working with a physician, I would add. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'd like to
Maybe
ask
more-
you, Dr. Campbell, about the possibility of reversing or controlling type 1 diabetes.
Yeah, type 1 diabetes is more difficult because that starts out, again, it's been totally been coupled with the early consumption of dairy. Because when that is done, the body learns how to react against the proteins in the dairy, and that then forms antibodies. Those antibodies are formed very specific for a certain kind of protein that has essentially like 17 amino acids in a row. That antibody that forms to react against that foreign protein turns around and starts to hit the cells in the pancreas, the islet cells that form insulin. So it destroys the islet cells. Therefore, that starts diabetes, and it's a lifelong experience for the most part. So they have to take, appropriate medication to ward that off. However, this diet works on type 2 diabetics very well. We can turn that around in a matter of days. Type 1 diabetics, I've actually met a couple of type 1 diabetics who also saw something very similar, and it's similar to what I've seen in the literature. Type 1 diabetes, you would think, could not be affected by diet because they lost their islet cells. Well, lo and behold, some are finding that they do see at least a reduction in their use of medication. I don't know. The jury's still out on that. But I'm going to suggest that if there is an effect, it also may be able to help the type 1 diabetes. But they got to handle their question fairly carefully, under the care of a physician, if that were to be tried. Yes. Okay, I'm going to suggest we take a little bit of a break, and I'll come back and then do the second lecture.
You
That's
want
okay?
5 minutes until top
Yeah.
of the hour? Okay,
Yeah.
that's great.
Okay,
That's
thank you.
fantastic. Good.
Okay, here we go for the second one. Okay, my second part of the story, namely having to do with the wholeness of food, with a focus on that. In the first lecture, I focused on the question concerning our emphasis given to protein. In this case, I want to talk about this concept of wholeness, which I think is terribly important as well. And I got my first lesson on this quite a number of years ago in about 1980 with this study here. At that time, we were working with our model in the laboratory, finding that we could turn cancer on and off and things like that. And this paper came out, very interesting. Namely, it showed that if we just look at let me change things around here a little bit. There's a report of lung cancer forming in people and smokers to see what.
So
what
again,
might-
if you're moving slides again, we're not seeing.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry, what happened? I don't understand this. I might have to come back and go out.
That's
back
right.
into it again.
Mhm.
Okay, let's try it one more time.
All right.
First time this has ever happened that way.
Yeah.
Okay, do you see it?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, good, thank you. So there's a representation here that was of a study that was done in 1981 by another group on lung cancer, smoking, and in this case, beta carotene consumption. And it's a three-dimensional slide, as you can see. We see on this axis here that people who are heavy smokers, that is consuming cigarettes or using cigarettes for more than 30 years, compared to those using less than 30 years, compared to non-smokers. If we look at the production of lung cancer in these smokers, you can see it's very much higher in people using more cigarettes, obviously. But there was something else that they studied they saw in this particular study that really caught a lot of attention. Namely, it turned out, if we look on this axis here, they also measured the amount of beta carotene in the blood of these heavy smokers and divided into different 4 quartiles. And what they found was that the higher the level of beta carotene, in the blood, it did that too, but the amount of beta carotene being consumed. Beta carotene is only in plants. It's the precursor to vitamin A, if you will. So they measured that, and they measured the beta carotene consumption. And as you can see, as beta carotene consumption increased along this axis here, lung cancer went down among the heavy smokers. Pretty amazing. I mean, that's almost a perfect dose-response relationship. In other words, people using a lot of cigarettes, if they were just eating plants, more and more plants, they actually brought their risk of lung cancer almost down to zero. Amazing. At that time, there was some concern about even talking about that study because it might intercept an interest in getting people to stop smoking. But what it showed to me was a dimension of a really serious problem, namely lung cancer and smoking. I mean, let's face it, it's very serious. People should not smoke. But what it showed is there is the opportunity actually of nutrition, even acting on a really serious cancer like that. And in this case, it involved beta carotene, which comes from plants. And so with that in mind, a study was organized a little bit later to test the ability of beta carotene to, let's say, reduce the risk of lung cancer among smokers. And this was a joint study between the United States scientists and Norwegian scientists. They started out their study with 29,000 male smokers, and they were going to follow them up for 8 years. It turned out they had to stop the study a little bit early because of the results I'll show you in a moment. But in any case, it was a pretty good sized study at the time. Half were given beta carotene as a supplement. The other half were basically just without the supplement, and they were going to follow them up for 8 years. This is a representation, if you can see, it meant to be a representation of lung cancer. Here's what they found. Those who were increasing their food beta carotene consumption, in other words, plant foods, they saw a decrease in lung cancer and was statistically significant in that just in a short period of time, quite frankly. They saw a decrease in lung cancer within 5 years. That was statistically significant if they get beta carotene from the food. In contrast, if they got the beta carotene from a supplement, it did the opposite. The beta carotene was associated with an increase in lung cancer, and again, it was statistically significant. That was a wake-up call. That was suggesting that when a nutrient is present in the food, it might do its thing. When it's put out, taken out, and used as a supplement, all bets are off. I call this holism. That's everything working together, all the nutrients working together, and I'll get into that more detail in this lecture. I call this reductionism. The reduction is an old word. It's been around a long time. It's the idea of focusing on just one thing at a time, like just beta carotene by itself, or maybe just one kind of cancer. So this is sort of, for me, a distinguish between these two concepts, holism and reductionism. Now, I wanted to just draw to your attention another idea concerning this thing about reduction in nutrition. And we're going to take, for this example, vitamin C. If we, let's say, get ourselves 100 grams of apple, and we determine how much vitamin C is in the apple, we find there's 5.7 milligrams of vitamin C in the apple. Fair enough. So let's see what happens here with this. So if we take the vitamin C and put it in a supplement and then administer it to people, let's say we will get, just arbitrarily, let's say 5.7 units of vitamin C activity. There's different ways to test the vitamin C effect, by the way, but in this case, it's theoretical. You take the 5.7 milligrams of vitamin C, you put it into a tablet, you administer it, you see what the activity is. Let's just call it 5.7 units of activity. Now, however, the 5.7 milligrams in the apple, in contrast, you take 100 grams of apple, put it in the same test, it gives 1,500 units of vitamin C activity. So the vitamin C in the tablet or in the supplement does not even come close to matching the vitamin C activity in the apple. Now, some of that so-called vitamin C activity in the apple obviously is being contributed by other substances that are equivalent to vitamin C, but it demonstrated the point too, that when vitamin C is present in the apple, the whole food form, it's a different story than it might be when it's taken as a supplement. Now, that caused an enormous amount of consternation and hand-wringing at the time in the scientific community, because there was hopes at that time of possibly being able to develop nutrisupplements to address this question concerning the effect of food on various diseases. And so from that point onwards, during the 1980s into the 1990s, a lot of studies were conducted of other vitamin supplements to see what effect they may have. And a number of them have shown that when nutrients are put in the form of a vitamin all by itself, it may have downside. Generally speaking, it doesn't have any effect, but it actually may cause the opposite. In other words, here's a study here showing that vitamin E increases hemorrhagic stroke by 74%. Here's one, calcium and vitamin D increases cardiovascular events. Another one, another vitamin E story here, increasing prostate cancer by 17%. And there's a lot more studies of that sort of nature. So now I want to go to the question concerning holistic nutrition. What is this thing that I refer to as holistic nutrition? There's various ways of thinking about this, because I'm actually talking about the whole being greater than the sum of its parts in a sense. And I've got 5 different ways I want to consider with you of how we unfortunately have become so focused on what individual nutrients can do rather than focusing on the food. The first thing has to do with our presumption of how much nutrient is present in the food. That is the nutrient amount being consumed. Let's have a look at that. And I'm going to use for my example here to make the point of comparing the nutrient contents along this axis here on the left for a bunch of different nutrients. I'm going to compare the contents in 6 different kinds of nuts. Now, we would assume that nuts are rather similar to each other in terms of nutrient activity. We know there's some differences, but more or less they should be somewhat similar, at least compared to, let's say, a potato, or compared to a legume or something of that sort. So let's look at all these different numbers here for the nutrient contents of these different nuts. And again, with the thing in mind that they are, each of them has that's been measured for, and each of them has more or less the same amount of nutrients. It turns out protein is highest in almonds. Okay. Polyunsaturated fatty acids, which is the kind of fatty acid present in plants, if you will, are highest in walnuts. A lot higher than, let's say, cashews, 13.4 versus 2.2, and so forth, 2.2 in hazelnuts. Hazelnuts are highest in the monounsaturated fatty acid, which some people consider, and a little bit of evidence for this, that monounsaturated oils or fats are better than, let's say, the polyunsaturated or saturated. But in any case, hazelnuts are highest in the hazelnuts. Monounsaturated are highest in hazelnuts. Potassium is highest in pistachio nuts. Really quite a bit higher, if you will. Magnesium is higher in Brazil nuts. Iron in cashew nuts down here at the bottom. Far higher, for example, in walnuts. So the question becomes, which nut, if we're focused on wanting to get a particular kind of nutrient, which nut do we choose? And at what expense when we avoid, let's say, all the other nuts in order to get that one nut? So which nut is the healthiest? It's not possible to really decide which nut is the healthiest in my mind, because it depends on what are the nutrient content, if you will, but also it depends on which kind of outcome that we might be talking about of a particular nutrient, whether it's affecting this organ, that organ, this disease, that disease. We can't tell which nut is healthiest, which condition. One nutrient in a nut does not describe its whole nutritional value. That's the bottom line. And it's the same message that I tried to show with the beta carotene study too. One nutrient in a food does not describe its whole nutritional value. Unfortunately, we've had a lot of emphasis on the idea that one nutrient at a time may just work. At least it's used in advertising for that purpose. Okay, let's go to the second idea of this holist concept and working toward the idea that nutrients work together, not as single things. Let's work on this idea concerning the pathway of a nutrient through the body after it's being consumed. See what we see here. I'm going to suggest to you, here's a hypothetical pathway for a single nutrient in the food. We consume the food, single nutrient, now it's going to travel through the pathway, through the body. Okay, first it gets digested, obviously. And the amount what that means is, and during the stage of digestion, the intestinal contents are stripping away the nutrients from the food that's been consumed and preparing them for less absorption. So the rate at which the food is being digested, the rate at which the nutrients are being extracted from the food differs. It may be high, maybe low, if you will. But then there's another stage. then of the amount that's being digested, what percent then gets absorbed? That varies too. That varies, how much gets absorbed. But it counts, how much is being absorbed. That's an important part of this story. And then once the nutrient gets in the blood, some nutrients are carried in an inactive form and partly in inactive, partly in an active form. The amounts that's in the active versus inactive form, that kind of trades off. It's shifting too. And then finally, the nutrient comes to a cell, some organ in the body. And the rate at which the nutrient passes into the cell is also regulated. And it can vary by quite a bit. So the amount that's been transported in the blood and delivered to the cells, the amount that actually gets into the cells, it varies quite a lot. Once it gets into the side of the cell, then we get into a real mix of stuff. Tremendous amount of metabolism, then all bets are off. You know, what's going to happen to it at that point in time? Finally, it's excreted. Here's my main point for showing this. The body adjusts the amount of nutrient passing through each stage, and this is real data, we know this. The body is able to adjust the amount digested or the amount that's absorbed of the stuff that is digested. The body adjusts that by upwards of 20% or more. That's a big adjustment. So the amount that's in the food, which we don't know in the first place, really, from the nuts study I just showed, we don't know how much nutrients we're really consuming. In theory, we could determine how much is in a glass full or spoonful, but in reality, it doesn't make any difference. So anyhow, let's say we theoretically know how much is in the food. We get here, we can't tell how much is being adjusted. That changes. We cannot, in the final analysis, we cannot know of the amounts that's in the food, how much is actually being used to function in the biochemistry of the cell. All bets are lost. These are like, I compare these different stages, and these are just some of the stages. I can compare each of these stages of adjustment like a transistor switch. You know, you have a light in a room, you can sort of turn it dim, make it dim and so forth. This is what's going on here. We got a bunch of transistor switches during this whole process, all operating. So to give us a result. Now let's suppose in this hypothetical pathway, we could do an experiment. We could know exactly how much is the food and how much, let's say we could do that. I could tell you, if we did that with one nutrient, all bets are off the moment we put a second nutrient in there, as would be present in food. So this is an entirely hypothetical discussion, because the nutrient that's present in food, of which we don't know exactly how much, we can't tell how much is coming down here to function. There's no way, especially when we're consuming it with all the other nutrients. So it brings us to this concept, at least for me, that nutrients in food are acting, in a sense, in concert with all the other nutrients that are there too, as to how much does this, how much does that, how much gets absorbed, transported, and so forth. There's a dynamic that we tend to forget about. We tend to think everything is static. You know, we want to know exactly how much is in the food, as if that's going to make any difference. We want to know in a chemistry lab, you know, how much is functioning for a certain reaction. Again, crazy idea. Let's go to the third thing here. I want to talk about this holistic nutrition concept. This has to do with the metabolism in the cells. And this is the stage that I referred to as function, you know, the last slide. So we're talking about nutrient metabolism within the cells. Now, at this point, the nutrients come into the cell. It's come into the cell. And when it gets into the cell, it's subjected to a bunch of reactions. Okay? And trying to get out of my way, some markers are on my screen. But in any case, it comes into the cell and it's subjected to a series of reactions. And here is the simplest of that series, some called the Krebs cycle, glycolysis. Some of you may be familiar with this. What this is that the energy that's used to create the chemicals in the first place, the energy of the sun in photosynthesis, it creates some chemicals here in the beginning. These substances, usually simple sugars, are then transformed through a series of reactions in order to extract some energy at various steps along the way. Solar energy coming in at the top, packed into the chemical energy of the chemical bonds in the compound itself. And then is extracted as we go forward, as we metabolize things, all along here, down here. This is where the energy is really taken out in a very active way. to form substances that then act in our behalf, various parts of the body. So that's that's the central theme of metabolism in some sense. I taught this myself in biochemistry many years ago, and I was really fascinated at that time because we were just learning about some of these kinds of things, and there was maps being made of these, and people were keeping hanging on the walls and stuff like that, watching the formation of these maps. The complexity here is pretty enormous, as you can see. All these different reactions, these letters, these are substrates, and that one there gets converted to that one, now it's converted to that one, so forth. Each of these, there's enzymes there. Enzymes are made of protein. They're adjusting things as they go along. Finally, we got to having maps like this. We couldn't even, I mean, it was ridiculous. The number of reactions being discovered over those years just expanded beyond belief. And this is only a tiny fraction of total metabolism. There's so many reactions going on in our cells. 100 trillion cells, 10 to 100 trillion cells in one cell. All these reactions are going on at the same time. And so here's the rabbit hole we traveled during the last 2 decades. We've assumed that, okay, let's go ahead. We're going to get diseases. They're going to happen, period. We don't know why, so forth and so on. And we're going to learn something about the biochemistry of the disease formation. We're going to also learn which reaction, in theory, not quite, it doesn't happen this way in reality, quite frankly, but we're going to determine which among the many reactions in the body we might find that, let's say, is the key reaction to stop whatever is happening that we don't like. And if we can find that one reaction, maybe we can develop a drug. I referred to that in the last lecture on protein. If we can identify one key reaction and then synthesize a chemical, we've got a drug. We got a drug. So that's the basis for the entire drug industry, that somehow we're going to be able to develop these chemicals, not that they don't do anything, because they can, in fact, do some things in certain circumstances. But in any case, we form a drug, synthesize a drug, and to come to one reaction. Actually, all drugs have side effects, multiple side effects. That's something we have to deal with. They may a short while here and there do something, but they have multiple side effects. In contrast, the nutrition protocol, multiple reactions, multiple nutrients, no side effects. So if we're eating the right food, all of this stuff here is working together in symphony. It's working together in symphony. And there's no way under the sun, I don't care, 1,000 years into the future, we're going to even develop computer models to display anything more than a static array of these reactions, because they're changing. These reactions change relative to each other every nanosecond, even shorter periods of time. It's a continuum. These reactions are all going on at the same time, and there's some other kind of force in there that's controlling what they're going to do, for good or ill. So the nutrition protocol, when we provide the food and the right kind of foods, somehow nature has kind of worked it out to handle this in a nice harmonious way for all of this to work together in a sense. I want to show you where a real example that everyone knows about of taking the drug route. Here, we once knew that coming down this pathway, as I mentioned before, it comes down to a really key compound we call acetyl-CoA. Anybody in biochemistry knows all about acetyl-CoA. It's got a key juncture point before it jumps off into this cycle. But in any case, acetyl-CoA is the first substance that leads to goes through a series of reactions to form cholesterol. Here's a series of reactions. It goes from acetyl to CoA. Cholesterol. Okay, we thought then that cholesterol is bad. Higher cholesterol causes heart disease, right? And we thought, oh, we shouldn't be consuming cholesterol. That was a mistake. But in any case, the cholesterol is being synthesized. So we thought we had some smart ideas. We're going to identify the reaction in that sequence, that if we can find that one mechanism, to intercept, we can block cholesterol synthesis. Because it was known or thought that the higher cholesterol levels in the body is heart disease. We don't want that around. Actually, we need cholesterol, by the way. It's important. Our body decides on how much to synthesize. So that's one point to make. But in any case, it would determine which reaction was responsible for, the key rate limiting reaction, if you will, and then we can make a chemical. That was found. maybe we can stop it right there on that theoretical reaction. That was the statins. That was the statins. That's the birth of the statins. The statins were then used to block cholesterol. And the question arises, does that really block heart disease? The best of studies shows that maybe you might see 5-10% blockage, 10, 15, some will argue maybe it's 15 or 10-15% reduced heart disease risk. That's nothing compared to the 95% reduction that we get using diet. And statins, by the way, have side effects. So here's the most common, best known probably of all drugs, a few billions of dollars worth of use that we've been using to sort of reduce heart disease, thinking that it's doing some great things, it has side effects. It doesn't really work all that well, quite frankly, at the end of the day, not compared to diet. Diet is far superior. Okay, so much for metabolism. We do that all the time. It is the basis, it's a fundamental basis for drug discovery and drug utilization. Let's go to another one. Let's talk about causal mechanism. I referred to this before. This is another way of developing this concept of holism. I showed you a bunch of reactions here. For the effect of protein on causing cancer, you recall all these different reactions here in the first stage and the reactions here, and they all work together, remember? How 8 of them increased, that was more cancer, 2 of them decreased. That was too bad because they were protective of that. That still meant more cancer. So somehow, just eating a protein-based diet, animal protein-based diet, you could multiply this by 100,000, 1 million probably, of activities to add to this equation. They all work together. They work together. When you consume a whole food, everything is nicely working. I mean, Mother Nature has had some time to work on this, and it's worked out. How to arrange and manage this, a marvelous state of biochemistry. Okay, so that's causal mechanisms. We think of disease as one disease at a time, which is a mistake, quite frankly. We think of one cause causing that disease. We try to control it. Again, probably a mistake. We think of one mechanism, so we can make a drug. We think of one drug, on and on and on. That's reductionism instead of holism. Here, one more thing. If we can think about holism as a marvelous symphony within our body going on, somehow all reacting together. That's the amazing thing. Reacting in real time, every nanosecond, adjustments are being made to allow this incredibly impressive body that we have to work. And all we need to do is to provide the body the right food, to provide the body the right food. Let nature decide which among all those nutrients, if you will, and other substances, which it wants to choose to do here, do there, go there, whatever. All of that happens in, as I say, split-second time. That's enough for on the basis of cells. Now, let me extend that holist concept one more stage. That's communication between, among and within cells. We know that cells talk to each other, by the way. They communicate with each other. And so they're really acting together. But now let's move it up one level further. There's instantaneous communication between the cells in big systems we have in our body. I just listed 5 systems. There's more systems, but we have the nerve system, the hormone system, you can see here. Each of these are very complex, as you can say. I mean, the immune system is one that's bringing it to our attention these days, but there's many parts of each of these systems. What's amazing about this is this holist concept applies to all of these together. It works in a cell, each cell of the 100 trillion cells, or whatever it is, and it works at that level. It works during digestion and absorption and so forth and so on. And then it turns out that when you stub your toe, you don't have to think about, oh, I stubbed my toe, maybe I should jerk my foot back. When you stub your toe, you automatically, it bounces back. There's a signal that the brain says, hey, I stubbed my toe, move that foot back. See, things happen so fast in our body, beyond our comprehension. It's subconscious, we don't even know about that. So I come back to my definition again. Holistic nutrition. This is what we need to focus on. If we're going to understand nutrition, we got to recognize this concept. We have multiple nutrients operating through multiple mechanisms, each one operating through multiple mechanisms, multiple disease, so forth and so on. with all these, thinking about all these metrics that I just mentioned. You basically, it's a simple idea. Eat whole food, eat plants, end of story. That's exactly the opposite of what we now do. The medical system we now have in the West, and unfortunately, other countries in the East are aspiring to this and very fast pace. But in any case, reductionist medicine we now have, we tend to think of one disease at a time. It's only got one cause, one kind of cause, one kind of mechanism. That's been the theme. That's so central. That's part of the constitution of our thinking in medicine almost. We're not allowed to think that one cause applies to more than one disease or one mechanism. We have to be very specific. You think about it in a very reductionist way. And I'm suggesting that's wrong. This is graduated into this concept called targeted drug therapy. We make drugs so they're targeted. Yeah, sometimes they can be used in a very short term. I don't doubt that. Very short, but as a lifestyle, forget it. What we're doing, we're using drugs to treat our illnesses that were created by the wrong food. We don't need to. We need to rely on drugs that way. Side effects are common. Unfortunately, this is why nutrition, which is holistic in concept, this is why nutrition is not taught in reductionist medical schools. There's not a medical school in the United States or elsewhere in Western Europe, I would suggest, or in Europe, in Western medicine. There's not a medical school any place that really seriously teaches nutrition. Oh, yes, they just said that 25% of the schools are offering a few courses, a few lectures, but just a few lectures, something less than, it's not the right kind of nutrition and it's meaningless. They're not teaching nutrition as a subject. Nutrition is not even considered to be a serious medical science, when it should be the premier medical science. And so I think you can see here now, at least I can see, why medical schools, which are built around the reductionist concept, we're going to use drugs. We're going to focus on one disease at a time. We got this, we got that, whatever. We're going to do that. We're going to treat with drugs. And we're going to overlook the one thing that does the most of all, holistic nutrition. Not only preventing the disease of operating in the first place, but actually in many cases, the same protocol being used to reverse disease, heart disease, diabetes, and so forth. I mean, we are just missing out. We're focused on one little bit of speck in the universe of ideas. Also, incidentally, at our National Institutes of Health in the United States, this is the premier research institution that provides funding. All of my research funding, by the way, came from, and I had generous amounts of funding over the years for decades. All of it came from the public taxpayer. None came from research. And at the most of it came from NIH. Actually, there's 27 institutes that are our premier research agency providing funding. 27 institutes. There's one for heart disease, one for diabetes, one for this, one for that, in a sense. Now, one is focused on nutrition. We don't have an institute of nutrition. That should tell you a lot about the state of affairs. We don't teach nutrition in medical schools. We don't focus on it, providing funding for doing research in this area. And furthermore, those of us in research in nutrition, we only address one nutrient at a time when we're working on it. We're missing out on a whole world of thinking and practice that actually could just resolve a lot of the problems we have as far as personal health is concerned. We're ignoring it. This is why nutrition is not considered a serious medical science. It's been stripped away. Nutrition has been stripped away from consideration ever since the first discovery of protein, I would argue. That's a whole story unto itself. I'm going to list here 16 things here just quickly. What this whole food plant-based diet, just a few facts. You'll have them, you can look at them later, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but here's some of the key points, sort of takeaway points that I've come for myself, and I've decided that it was mentioning. Ideal nutrition, which I mean by that, is provide a whole food plant-based diet to your lifestyle without added fat and refined carbohydrates. We don't need to add all that oil to food. There's no point. That's not a whole food. That's isolated out. And the oils that we tend to use are what we call pro-inflammatory. They're unsaturated. We thought they were good, but they're pro-inflammatory. They're coming from plants, yes, but when they're used in isolation like that, they cause problems. So we don't need to have a lot of sugar, refined sugars and fats to dress things up. Number two, whole food plant-based nutrition, as I already mentioned, prevents, same protocol. Seems to prevent and treat disease together. Just stick with it. It's a lifestyle. Whole food plant-based nutrition combines the effects of countless nutrients. Okay, we said that. This is what Aristotle said a couple thousand years ago. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Why do we ignore him? Here's whole food plant-based nutrition functions, of course, as I mentioned, by holist, not reductionist means. I've already emphasized that a few other places, but that's the point worth emphasizing. It's essentially this, the response from using this kind of diet is exceptionally broad in scope. I showed you that one slide where all kinds of different diseases, from autoimmune diseases in some cases, to maybe viral diseases, of course, to chronic degenerative diseases, pathogenic disease, response to the immune system, a very broad effect. Also, the effect is rapid. You know, we have evidence now that if people have diabetes and they switch to a whole food plant-based diet, they're on medication, if they don't drop their medication quickly, within a day or two, they might go into hypoglycemic shock, because the nutritional effect on diabetics is so strong, so powerful, so fast that they should really do that under the care of a physician, because they want to be able to drop their medication because the nutrition works so much better. Here's something important too. A lot of people I don't think recognize that there are people who sort of begin to learn about this idea of whole food plant-based nutrition and learning about it, and they like to try it, but they find it difficult. They can't make the transition very easily. What really happens, and this comes from just an observation, I don't think it's been tested all that well. If people stay with this diet for, let's say, a month, in some may have to stay a month, 2, or certainly 3. By that time, our taste preferences change. And when our taste preferences change, we begin to crave a salad, for crying out loud. We crave a salad, and we look back, we say, why do we ever eat that other food in the first place? I speak from personal experience, having been raised on a farm, living on meat, milk, and eggs, and my wife and my family do that, have done that for some time. Thanks to my wife, who actually prepares the food. She's done a fantastic job of doing that. Okay, so the whole food plant-based nutrients are effective, as I mentioned before, whereas supplemental nutrients are not. There's another thing to kind of tuck away in your mind too. We're talking about food, not supplements, food. That's what does the job. Nutrients function not by one, but multiple mechanisms. I've said that a few times. Okay, here's something with reference to genes. We all, all the disease, all kinds of things we have in our body begin with some genetic predisposition, if you will. We have good genes, we have bad genes, if you will. What's really interesting about this so far, on the basis of the evidence I've seen, the whole food plant-based diet upregulates the good genes, the ones that tend to create health. It upregulates these genes. That means these genes are then producing proteins that then act as enzymes that then does good things. So I use that word good genes somewhat carefully, I should say, superficially maybe. Hopefully that upregulates the good genes, and that then downregulates the bad genes. Good thing to keep in mind. I mention that because we're living in an age of genetic determinism in the minds of many. Somehow, if we were to learn which genes we have, and then we can develop a drug and block that gene and so forth, that's the future of medicine. No, it's not. No, that's not the way to go. The way to go is just to recognize what nutrition can do, let nature take care of that problem for us. Whole food plant-based nutrition is much less confusing. Don't sweat the details, in a nutshell. In other words, let's acknowledge that there's enormous complexity here that we'll never resolve. But let's not get caught in the weeds. Let's look at the big picture. Let's look at the tent over us. The whole food plant-based nutrition minimizes the effect of toxic agents. That's an interesting idea right there. I didn't get a chance to speak about. But what these toxic agents, sometimes they can initiate cancer, they can do this, that, and other things. It turns out, and this is a subject area of my own research program over the years too, that nutrition tends to minimize the effect of these agents, believe it or not. That doesn't give us license to use toxic agents, obviously. But quite frankly, we get some exposure to that sort of thing. But nutrition, if we do the right thing, we can minimize their effects. Whole food plant-based nutrition minimizes environmental problems. It minimizes environmental problems. I'm saying that because food to consume, the number one cause of global warming and environmental problems these days, according to some really good research that's been coming out for the last couple of decades, the number one problem causing this, the number one practice that should cause environmental concerns is the food we eat. That's what I'm put in a nutshell. That's a big story. I don't quite get into it here, but the whole food nutrition also promotes social welfare and for all living beings. In other words, I'm talking about something that would care for all sentient beings, animals, welfare animals. And we don't need to kill the billions and billions of animals just to get that good protein. That's nonsense. We're only doing it for money and for creating some sickness that in turn provides patients for even a bigger industry. The whole food plant-based nutrition minimizes healthcare costs. Imagine this. I mean, in the United States, we're very private sector oriented, capitalist oriented, where we spend a lot of money on healthcare. I'm saying, if people were just to know this information, do their own thing, they can reduce healthcare costs tremendously. I say whole food plant-based nutrition must be the future, as it was during the age of nature. Now I'm using that comment, age of nature, a little bit sarcastically. I would argue that, most of our existence on this earth has been during the age of nature. We've watched nature work. We've watched how she organizes things. I can see it in cells. I can see it in the body. I can see it in the biochemistry. We have strayed from that model of nature so far. We're in a chemical, physical kind of dimension, a materialistic way of thinking about the human body, as if we're going to solve problems by focusing on the chemicals, as if they're going to create our bionic cells. Let's fall back. Let's do something that nature provided in the first place. Let's just use nutrition. And just to summarize quickly on the environmental question, I've just listed here just some. There's more. I've just listed here some of the items that now are being studied by various groups. It's a crisis of our entire system. And I'm listing them in two different categories: environmental concerns and human health concerns. There's more. This is just a sample. Environmental concerns, we are concerned about climate warming, as you know, the topsoil loss, a big deal. Species loss, gosh, we lost like 30% of the species in the world because of the way we practice agriculture. That's ridiculous. Bees are getting lost. I see it just in my lifetime. The deep water aquifers that fuel we can dig down deep, get water to supply agriculture, farming, if you will. Those deep water aquifers, the water in those aquifers are declining at an alarming rate. Ocean pollution, another one. Deforestation, you know all about that. And these are just some environmental issues. Each one tend to be considered, separately in their own domain, their own silo. Groups working on this, groups working on that, so forth. Over here in the human health side, look, healthcare costs is a problem. Economists get interested in that, policymakers. Why just those people? That's a reflection of something more else. We depend on drugs, prescription drugs. They have side effects. We have high disease mortality. Why does the diseases like the degenerative disease, are they on the increase? At least in the United States, why are they on the increase? Well, we're also increasing our use of drugs. Increasing drug use, getting more disease. What's going on here? Now, life expectancy in the United States is becoming shorter the last 4 or 5 years. And we have unequal health service, inequitable health services. So I put this picture here because we tend to think of each of these in their silos. Each group of individuals, honorable people, working hard, dedicated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they tend to live in their own silo. And they tend to look for individual causes and solutions for each of these problems. I'm going to say there's one cause. Eat the right food. Eat the right food. In every case, I can make an argument here, a very powerful argument, I think, that if we were to eat the right food, whole food, plant-based, right to eat right food, these kind of problems here would just begin to disappear. So consume plants, consume the whole food. That's what I'm saying. I told that in another book I wrote after the China study that you may know about, came out in 2013. It turns out that the China study is very well. This surprisingly also been translated into a number of languages. They don't lost count, but this one is really. I notice it's getting more attention, more and more attention. It's very exciting. There's a whole conference coming up basically in February in this country, just called Whole, just on this concept. It's a reflection on nutrition from a different perspective, as I've emphasized here. Everything working together at all levels of organization. And I'll finish with telling you, mentioning to you, an online certificate program we have at Cornell University called Plant-Based Nutrition. We've had this for some time. It came out of some classes I was teaching on the campus before I retired when I was 67, I should say. Anyhow, this plant-based nutrition certificate is based on good science. We offer continuing education credits. We're fortunate to have been borrowing from a number of colleagues who are participating in this. This comes under the label nutritionstudies.org, if any of you are interested. And at that point, thank you so much again for listening. I hope I've actually dropped enough maybe controversial ideas here for you to at least think about. But think of it in the context of the whole, doing this thing, and we can all be better off for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Taking questions.
Gretchen asked one in the chat that's really, I would love to hear the answer. Gretchen, want to read it?
I don't hear anything here. Am I still on?
Gretchen, you're on mute.
While they're looking for Gretchen, let me ask you, Dr.
It's in the
Campbell,
chat.
about the role of fish in a whole foods diet.
Yeah, that's been discussed quite a bit. There was an understanding for a while, and I was one of the people too, that fish, more or less fish of the right kind, taken from the deep oceans, not necessarily the farm fish, that the fish could be better. If there was an exception, that would be okay. However, a lot of the fish is actually contaminated, as we now know, with foreign stuff, and that's a problem. It's a pretty serious problem, quite frankly, I think. And also the protein in fish, by the way, I should say, acts in a rather similar way to mammalian protein. Not quite as bad, at least according to some of the data I know, but fish is in the same category as other animal foods. So it's your judgment. It's your judgment, I think. I think they're less, they don't have the antioxidants like plants do. So if there's going to be one exception or two exceptions, maybe fish a little bit, maybe something like fermented dairy. Somebody's not asking about that, like yogurt. Yogurt fish is sort of in that classification that if we're looking for exceptions, there's a couple of ideas there. But it's a good idea, on the other hand, to kind of stick with the plants as much as possible. And what we find is that it becomes a way of life and a way of health.
And the use
What
of
is
oil.
your take on the
But
what is your take on the incredible number of nutraceuticals that are prescribed by functional medical doctors as indicated by needs from their patients' lab results?
I don't take kindly to that. I know the people who started that activity is called functional medicine. And the founder of that, person I know, I've known for a long time, since about 1980 or so. And then another guy came along, I don't want to use names in this case, became the president of the functional medicine, that institute. I was told, they both told me that because they came and asked me to lecture at their annual conference back in the 90s. Wanted to know what happened to me because they said that the idea for functional medicine, nutraceuticals, if you will, that was actually founded on the basis of what I was teaching in the 1970s and 1980s. And they wanted to know, why did I stray from the flock? Functional medicine, unfortunately, it sounded like a concept worth considering, but it's nothing more than an elegant way of thinking about reductionist medicine. They say we're going to identify this function treated with this nutrient or nutraceutical. They even change the name of the nutrient to nutraceutical. They're right up front to tell you that we're going to turn nutrients into pharmaceuticals. That's why they came up with the term nutraceutical. I don't believe it whatsoever. I don't support that movement. It's been, as I say, I was told by the founder that they started in large measure because of what I was teaching this when I was teaching biochemistry before I got into all of this stuff. But I don't support it.
Dr. Campbell, thank you so much for your time. What about vitamin D? Because vitamin D, they say that we can't get enough sun, so it needs to be supplemented. What's your feeling on that?
That's an old story. It goes back to the 1920s, of course, when vitamin D was first discovered. And then it was discovered because it was believed that, rickets in children was attributed to a lack of vitamin D, which they isolated. In turn, they learned too that the vitamin D forms in our skin by our exposure to sun. So a story developed over time that we need vitamin D. And frankly, vitamin D is not a vitamin. The definition of a vitamin is something we must consume because we can't make it. In this case, we can make vitamin D. All we need to do is get some sunshine exposure enough. But then there's been some feeling that some people don't get enough sunshine. Well, they don't. They just simply don't. And in those circumstances, some vitamin D supplementation might be worthy of consideration. But I don't think we need to be carried away with the darn thing. It turned, there's a kind of an ugly part of that story has been told recently, and I don't feel like repeating it here. But one of the key individuals who was actually orchestrating some of that euphoria for vitamin D use in the recent decades has been cited in the newspapers as being heavily influenced by an industry that was selling that stuff. So once again, it's an ugly side of nutrition. And I think we've overemphasized the vitamin D story. I don't mean to though, on the other hand, to detract from the recommendation of some of my physician colleagues. A little vitamin D on special occasions might be useful, but we need to do some testing on that one to first establish the point. I think we shouldn't just helter-skelter jump into that world of, taking vitamin D as much as we can. It can be toxic, actually.
Thank you.
Cannot ask oil.
Yeah.
Dr. Campbell, again, a question about the use of oil.
Yeah, oil. Most of the oil, oil by definition is liquid fat. And oil, when it's liquid like that, is made up of what we call polyunsaturated fats, which come pretty much from plants. So there was a time back in the 50s, late 50s, early 60s, when it was decided that saturated fat in animal food like milk and stuff was not good. That was a mistake, focusing on that way. So they said, okay, let's have plant oils. So a huge industry emerged in the 60s, creating oil from plants, extracted from plants. And people started using that instead of animal fat, as if it was a good thing. It turns out the oils, when those oils are present in plants, yes, they're doing good. But when we take them out once again, now we've got oils, and most of which are what we call I can't think of the word. They're the omega-6 type pro-inflammatory. They're pro-inflammatory, and they encourage aging. They contribute to cancer. So oils taken out of the context of the whole plant turns into a different animal, or I shouldn't use that word, but it turns into a different kind of beast, if you will. It's not the same as it is when it's in the plants. It's good in plants. Take it out in a bottle? No. pour that all over their food like what I like to do, especially on salads and stuff like that. Not a good idea. Those pro-inflammatory oils are used in excess, and they are associated with increased aging and cancer, I might add, and heart disease. So I'm not a fan of added oil.
Dr. Campbell, we are thanking you so much for the systemic crisis being mentioned here, because we are considering the season and the food accessible in seasons. The difficulty with eating too much fat in the hot summer and too much vitamin C in winter. What do you say about how we can use the calendar eating with the change of the calendar as well?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I heard all the details, but I should mention that has been this idea about food being related to environmental problems of various kinds. And that erupted for me, at least with the World Bank in the late 1970s. I was invited to come and give a lecture at that time, and they came up with a paper. That was the first paper that was published out of that suggested that 50% or more of climate warming and environmental problems was associated with food. What they were referring to was livestock, because livestock, when we raise livestock, and coming from a livestock farmer myself, you use a lot more land than otherwise would be necessary if we got the food from the plants. And so it really came down to the kind of diet we use, which is heavily animal-based, to get that good protein, if you will. And so that triggered a lot of changes. When we consume more animal food, we consume less plant food, and so forth and so on. And so various people have come along and attributed the environmental impact, whatever it may be, to one or two things at a time. I think that's not a good idea. What we need to do is just change the total diet, And I'm going to, if we are concerned about the environment, as we should be, that is the number one existential problem of the day, in my view. Things are changing rapidly. We've got to get away from livestock farming and start, using plants. We can talk about plant growth and development. We call it sustainable agriculture. That's a popular term right now being used. That we can talk about all kinds of plants, how to use them and how to grow them better and how to sustain our use and do it more cheaply, et cetera. So there's a whole industry emerging, social movement, I should say, emerging in that story. But I don't want to get too much into more details about that, because it ends up being a detail once again, when we should be facing the big question.
Well, Dr. Campbell, it remains only to give our great appreciation and gratitude to you. This has been an incredible presentation by you and leaving all of us, I think I can say, thirsty for more. So we thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's fantastic.
Thank you very much.